Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome in, folks. Good afternoon, everybody. What's up, folks? Hi, everyone. Welcome in. Welcome in. Or Daniel, Anna. I almost said both of your names together, like Danyana, and then that wasn't correct. That's not correct at all. Not correct at all. Hi, folks. Welcome in. Hola, Luca. Oh, geez. I just realized the beep is still going. There we go. Hi, folks. Welcome in. Okay, we got a good day ahead of us. We have our final lesson for the week, and then we are going to move on to a bit of a work period in that context. So when we look at that, we will take a bit of time to talk about the lesson, and then ultimately give you that extra bit of time to work on our lab activity. So we got a nice little day planned. My hope is that we can make best use of our time humanly possible. Hello, Kiora, Natalia. Hello, hello. And yeah, so let me just get attendance going over the next minute or two. Hang tight if you want to bring up the lessons. Lesson 6, blank document. Follow along. You'll have a nice little video to watch as well. That's in the outline for our Unit 3. And yeah, we'll get started in just a second. Alrighty, attendance is just about finished. Just making some notes about a couple of things. Take a look who we're missing. Okay. And we'll get started in just a second, folks. Just a second. A lesson is the worst B-Day present ever. Yes, you're welcome, Maddie. Happy birthday. That's funny. Maddie just typed that as Anna was saying, Haps Maddie. That's very silly. Happy birthday, Maddie. Happy birthday. Alrighty. Yes, happy birthday to Maddie. Sorry, folks, I'm just taking one or two more notes. And I can't seem to find who I'm missing. Because I am missing someone. Alicia, Anna, Arlene, Ashley, Celestine, Daniel, Dominic, Emily, Hamid, Han, Howlin, Helen. Oh, yes. That's who I'm missing. Kiora, Ken, Joseph, Janice. Jonathan. Beauty. Found him. Uh-oh. 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 Made a boo-boo. Oh, there they are. All right, folks, let's get started. We are looking at lesson 6 today, evolution without. Can you play a birthday song for Maddie? At the end, I will play a happy birthday song for Maddie. At the end of class. I want to try to get this lesson done and dusted as quickly as possible because I really want to give you all that time to take a look at this material as well as how it relates to the lab, because this and lesson 5 are really going to be heavily contributing to your understanding that you will need to complete that lab and understand it in its entirety. So without further ado, let's get to evolution without natural selection. So where natural selection is at work, these traits that are favored are going to be selected for in a given environment, right? Because this is going to allow for that increase in overall fitness. And that increase in overall fitness is what we're talking about with regards to evolution via natural selection. Again, we're looking to improve that natural ability to survive and that fitness level to allow for reproduction in that population in a given environment. However, this is not always the case. Okay, this is not always the case. There are going to sometimes be evolutionary changes in a population that are not based on the specific trait that's being selected for in an environment. Because at the end of the day, natural selection in a perfect vacuum will select for those traits that are successful in an environment. But there are many, many, many different things that can happen within that population or within the environment, within the planet, even as a whole, that can have an impact on the way that that species develops and in terms, technically, how that species evolves. So we're going to look at a couple of different examples of how a species can change and evolve as a result of non-trait-based evolution, i.e. non-natural selection. And the reason that it can happen due to non-natural selection is something that's is as a result of something called genetic drift. So genetic drift, remember, changes to an allele frequency in a population is evolution, right? When we see that natural selection select for a specific trait, that allele frequency changes. The more higher fitness level ability or allele increases in frequency, and the lower fitness level decreases in survivability. So we're talking about the overall way in which a species can survive. Okay? What am I missing? I have one too many people. Oh yeah, Helen's not here yet. So when you think of it that way, it's really, truly important to recall that at the end of the day, natural selection is for a trait. Natural selection is for a trait. Okay? Natural selection is for a trait. Whereas genetic drift isn't always for a trait. Oops. And it more importantly applies to small populations. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, Mr. Q, how can it be evolution if it's to small populations? Well, the way that that happens is things get propagated. When I get to my one example about the cheetahs, you'll see what I mean. So genetic drift is caused by random events that are not predictable or not considered in the principles of natural selection. So we'll talk about a couple of natural disasters. The asteroid that destroyed the dinosaurs, for all intents and purposes, is a really good one to talk about because a completely random event that the dinosaurs had no way of knowing, nature had no way of knowing. And so that was not natural selection that destroyed them, i.e. a random event. Because changes in allele frequencies will also change the phenotypic ratios. And that's what we're going to be considering again. Was there a catastrophic event after the asteroid? Yeah, the big freeze or the ice age, that if it didn't die from that initial impact, they all pretty much died afterwards. So it was like 4 or 5 random events. Well, not random. Once the asteroid hit, it wasn't random afterwards. It was easy to predict. But again, right, it's not taken into consideration for natural selection. That's the big thing, right? It's non-natural selection selected for or connected. All right. So again, that change in allele frequency will also change the phenotype ratio that we see in a population. And again, we're looking at in terms of change and in terms of fitness. We're not considering natural selection, but it is still considered a form of evolution because we are seeing that phenotypic and genotypic ratio change as a result of allele frequency distribution. Okay. So what are some examples? Let's take a look at some of those examples now. So the first example that I want to talk about with you all, is we have this population of bugs. And there's 9 bugs in total, and 2/3 are brown, 1/3 are green. And this population is right beside a human. And that human, as they walk, steps on 2 of the 3 green bugs. Now, as a result of that human stepping on 2 of the 3 green bugs, we see the ratio change in that population. 6/7 are brown and 1/7 are green. So we have original population to the left. Then genetic drift happens. Remember, genetic drift is a random event. In this case, just a person walking, stepping on that green bug or those green bugs. And that changes the afterwards phenotypic expression of that population. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Mr. Q, there's no population of bugs with just 9 bugs. Yes. However, again, this example, we're looking at smaller populations, and this is a hyper simplified example. To the right, we see a bit more of a simplified example in the context of some of these population members die out due to something. And as a result of that dying out, which we call genetic drift, we see the population distribution change, that phenotypic distribution, allele distribution change. Original population, equal distribution between all 4, right? Equal distribution between all 4. And now, after that genetic drift event, 2 of those 4 populations increased in percentage ratio, right? Originally, all of them equally, 5 of 20. But after that genetic drift, we see a change in the population phenotype. And as a result, the alleles change. So this is one hyper simplified example of what could happen in terms of genetic drift. We're going to look at a more specific example or more specific examples as we move through this. But again, recall the most important aspect to think of with regards to all of these examples is that evolution is a change in allele frequency, right? Natural selection is that change in allele frequency due to the environment selecting for those traits, but evolution as a whole is just a change in allele frequency. So in these examples, we are seeing, for a lack of better word, some form of evolution. Okay, questions? So this is just one example of genetic drift. Just one example of genetic drift. Just gonna check my email real quick. Alrighty, so let's move on and take a look at another example that's connected to genetic drift, but not quite. Well, it is, but the important thing to recognize here is that when I talk about genetic drift, right? When I talk about genetic drift, we're looking at just the random event that happens, nothing else, nothing else. The random event that leads to that allele frequency change, that's what genetic drift is. Once we start to consider what happens after the genetic drift, when we talk about after the genetic drift, we are talking about what's called genetic bottlenecking. Now, what genetic bottlenecking is a dramatic decrease in population size that leads to genetic drift. So what that means is genetic drift happens as a result of genetic bottlenecking. Now, what is genetic bottlenecking? Well, we have a population of blue and yellow marbles in a jar or in a container, and we shake that container up. Let's say it's like a wine bottle or whatever. Shake that container up, and we pour out only 10. We only pour out 10 of those marbles into a glass. Those are what's called surviving individuals. So the bottleneck is the event that prevents more than the original population distribution from going on. And those surviving individuals go on to make that next generation. They reproduce and pass on their alleles. So what does this mean in the context of evolution? Well, we're going to look at the example of cheetahs. There was a mass extinction event for cheetahs 12,000 years ago. We know this for two reasons. The first, all cheetahs share about 99% of their DNA with each other, which is not that different from humans, which are like 96%, but it's a lot when you consider how that 3% difference in us or 4% difference in us allows for the huge amounts of variation that we see in our population. Cheetahs, however, only have about 0.1 or 1% genetic variation. And it's because 12,000 years ago, only 8 cheetahs survived this mass extinction event. And we know that only 8 cheetahs survived is that we can connect every single cheetah today to 8 variable different cheetahs from 12,000 years ago. Every single cheetah. Now, they haven't taken genetic information from every single cheetah. It's just a sample. But yes, it's also the same for people with blue eyes. It's also the same for people with red hair. If you have red or copper or red-ish hair, chances are you share the same ancestry with about like, it's again, going back like 20,000 years with about like 50 or 60 humans that had red hair. And so that shared ancestry to those 50 or 60 humans. So cheetahs, there's only 8 that survived. There's also a really cool book that I read. It's science fiction. It's called Seven Eves. It is a story. How is it only 50 to 60 humans? The genetics for red hair. Because the mutation that happened like 20,000 years ago for red hair, it propagated shortly over the course of like 2 or 3 generations to 50 or 60 humans. And then it didn't propagate. The mutation didn't happen in more than those people. And so they're the only ones who had the original mutation. And then it propagates out as a result of their mating habits. Yeah. And if you look back far enough genetically, there's about 50 or 60 humans that were connected essentially to the genetic forensic studies of people with red hair. So same thing happened with cheetahs. Same thing happened in the book that I read called Seven Eves. It's a story about 7 surviving human beings up in space, and they're all female, and they had to use some clever genetic tricks in order to reproduce the population. And 12,000 years later, all of the human race that lives in space is as a result of those 7 females that survived the extinction event. So same thing with cheetahs, 8 individuals. In this case, it was 3 males and 5 females. So a little bit better in that context than the book that I read. No need for clever genetic tricks. But a problem arose. Like in any small population that has to repopulate, the remaining cheetahs have such a small gene pool and fewer individuals to reproduce, it yields to a lack of variation. And again, we've learned that a lack of variation, it's bad. You want genetic variation in a population. Genetic variation in a population ensures that if something completely devastates the population, bacterial, viral, what have you, infection, that a good chunk will still survive. So only about a 0.1 difference in DNA between every single cheetah on this planet, which yields it to be very susceptible to disease. Because again, recall, viruses infect our cells, which attack DNA. And if the DNA of cheetahs is all the exact same for all intents and purposes, it lacks the genetic variation to be robust enough to survive. So how did they survive for so long? Well, very lucky, very lucky. And on top of that, human beings have now stepped in kind of to ensure that their populations are maintained. So it's fascinating to consider the idea of genetic bottlenecking as it relates to genetic drift. All right, questions. There are around 8,100 cheetahs as of 2020. Cool. I didn't know how many there were. And I would still say that they're considered endangered, but is it still on the endangered list? Is that why incest causes so many issues? Yes, that is why incest is bad. There's also, so like the main theory in with regards to animals, incest is like doesn't really happen, right? It doesn't really happen that often. It still does, mainly because the genetic variation in animals is a little bit different in humans. Most animals are significantly less complex than humans, but in very complex organisms, like dolphins, for example, like chimpanzees and ape families, as well as some horses and equine, interbreeding leads to a lot of issues. So that the dangers of incest, so to speak, it makes things challenging from a genetics perspective, because the cell machinery needs that variation, and without that variation, they need to the cells don't really work that well. Which scientists figured it out through their tomatoes? Tomatoes? Did I say something about tomatoes recently? Oh, okay. Oh, I don't know then. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I am uncertain. I've seen that someone figured out that incest with humans is bad because it messed up their plants. Huh. You find that, Maddie? That's interesting. Find that and let me know, because I'm curious about that. Like through because like incest ran rampant in like the feudal eras, like between the ages of like post Roman Empire, even in the Roman Empire, but like about 200 BC all the way up until about the 1700s, even a little into the 1800s. Like people would marry their like cousins or like keep it in the family, with regards to siblings being forced to marry to ensure that the dynasty continues. And yeah, it does mess up genetics quite a bit. Yeah, exactly. So I'd be curious to see that incest combined with plant situation. I'm not sure. I've never heard of that before. No. So there are 8,000 African cheetahs and only 50 Asian cheetahs. So those 50 are probably very, very similar. Yes, correct. I don't know. I don't really follow the royal stuff. It's not my cup of tea as far as I'm concerned. No idea. Who knows? Alrighty. Let's get into fun fact. You can marry your second cousin in Canada. Yeah. So that's, again, right? Ironically enough, that's enough genetic variation to be fine for the most part. That's why it's not illegal. Doesn't make it less weird, but that is not a fun fact. It doesn't make it less weird, but it is genetically feasible. The variation is different enough. And yeah, also it was Darwin who figured out that it was incest with his cousins were causing harmful recessive traits. Yeah, because he saw his learnings and undertakings from the Madagascar Islands. And when he saw animals that did not work very well, he realized that it was one generation removed only from the parent. And as a result of that, it led to significant genetic defects, which in turn caused non-viability in organisms. So yeah, Darwin was all about it, trying to figure it out. Why are some problems that can occur through incest? So the main thing is that at the zygote formation, the cell has trouble reading and differentiating DNA, like mother-father DNA. If the DNA is too similar, they have similar markers. And if they have similar markers, the cell doesn't know how to read the DNA in order to make the proteins that are responsible for making us human, right? So if the DNA has too many of the similar markers, then yeah, it's a little challenge. I saw this guy on TikTok that crossbreeds between species, and I don't know you could do that. I would not trust anything I see on TikTok in terms of crossbreeding, so I don't know either. In artificial selection, is there more of a chance that the species don't survive and reproduce? It depends what you're artificially reproducing or artificially selecting. It depends on what species you're working with, Anna. Like with dogs, for example, or plants that we use for food? No, I would say it's probably not, but it depends on what we're trying to artificially select for. Yes, that's why I'm giving you all this time to work on it. How many people? Do we have like double people in here? Ah, two Vanette. Okay. All right, let's move on to the founder effect, because after the founder effect, we have one more thing to do, and then I'm going to give you the rest of the period to work on your lab, because as Shafa says, it is a little time consuming, and I want to make sure you guys have enough time to work on it, both today and sometime next week. So what is the founder effect? Well, the founder effect is kind of what Darwin saw when he was exploring the Galapagos Islands. It's the idea, the idea that a small number of individuals moves from one existing population to live in a new location. And that new location is important to consider when we think about how Darwin observed those Galapagos Island species. So we have this ancestral or original population, probably on, in the case of the Galapagos, the coast of South America. In this example, we're looking at ladybugs. So about half the population is red, half the population is yellow. We have a ladybug that goes for a walkabout, a bunch of small ladybugs, a couple of small ladybugs, red ladybugs, go for a walkabout. They find their way to an island, and on that island, they got enough food to hang out. And so, of course, those red ladybugs reproduce, and we see a new colony with a new population and a new allele distribution. So evolution occurs here because we see a change in allele frequency based on individuals who move to a new location. So at the original ancestral location, we see an allele frequency of 50-50, yellow, red. But in this new location on this colony island, the Galapagos, quote unquote, we see what's called the founder effect, where a change in allele frequency or evolution occurs based on the individuals that have moved to that place. All right. Questions about any of those effects that we looked at today? Because then we're going to do some math and look at quadratic equations, which is very exciting for me. And you're all grumbling right now. I can already hear it. People hate math. It's such a depressing fact of life in my field. Yeah, I know. Yeah, we'll talk about CRISPR in a bit. I'll talk about CRISPR later. What a depressing thought. Everyone hates math. So sad. I would love to. What about math? Everyone's like, oh yeah, Maddie, happy birthday. No, we're not doing math. I'm just going to show you some math. There's a difference between doing and showing. Don't worry. I'm not going to make you do any math. You'll be lucky if I made you do math, but no, I'm not going to make you do any math. Grumble, grumble, grumble. As you show, do we need to do? No, you don't have to do. Math is so bad. Oh dear. Yeah. No, you don't have to do anything. All right, let's take a look at the Hardy-Weinberg principle while everyone grumbles. Yeah, said you're making this time-consuming variable. I'm sorry you feel that way. Make sure you know it well for the lab. Make sure you know it well for the lab. Or for the lab quiz, sorry. Calculus looks like the scariest math ever. No, calculus is actually the easiest math. There's not as much arithmetic. So if you're bad at arithmetic or factoring, well, no, factoring you still have to do. But if you're bad at arithmetic, adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing isn't your cup of tea, then calculus doesn't really have any of that. If you're bad at factoring, you're going to have to factor from now until the end of days in calculus. So anyways, all right, let's get on to the Hardy-Weinberg principle. So those of you grumbling about the lab can get some extra time to work on it. So what is the Hardy-Weinberg principle? The allele frequency in a large population will remain relatively consistent. Hardy-Weinberg, there were two scientists in Boston, and they assumed with their mathematical model that no evolution is happening. Now, I'll talk about some of the issues with regards to it, but ultimately, the idea here is that mathematical equation of this function here looks at the allele frequency within a population and the chance of those frequencies remaining consistent, or no evolution occurs. So the P variable is the frequency of the dominant allele. The Q variable is the frequency of the recessive allele. And the 1 represents, oopsie daisies, the 1 represents the population. The population. So 100% of the population must always be considered, because a population percentage-wise must always be considered at 100%, regardless of whether it goes up or down. It's just looking at the immediacy. Now, what do you notice about this that can be seen as no bueno? Or what can you see in terms of the idea here that may not actually be true, besides the fact that they assume no evolution is happening? What's an error or an issue that you can see arising from this function based on what I've pointed out? No mention for mutation. Yeah, that's one, Daniel. Good. What else? There's like 5. No, because it's the same variable. Because it's a perfect square trinomial, you need those variables to be the same there. So that perfect square trinomial allows for the factoring and understanding of it in the context mathematically. So nope, but good guess. What else could be seen as an issue? Is there any mention of codominance? Not necessarily, Dominic, because the variables can be changed, right? But there's no mention of codominance. There's no mention of incomplete dominance. It assumes that animals do not move. It assumes that animals do not mutate, as Daniel said. So there's a couple of assumptions that it makes outside of the no evolution assumption that maybe aren't that kosher. And so when you think about it in the context of the assumptions that it makes, it also assumes that no selection takes place. It assumes that no migration takes place. It assumes that mating is completely random, that there's no mutation, and that the population is very, very, very large. So all of these factors taken into consideration with regards to the Hardy-Weinberg principle or equation assumes that no evolution occurs and that allele frequencies in the equation stay the same. But does it? And that's, I think, important to look at. This is a great conversation to have with mathematical models, what we use math for, and then what we actually observe in the environment and in our studies. Because this model works well for dominant recessive alleles over a short period of time. But once you start applying it to large scale evolutionary timelines, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, the equation starts to fall apart. So while math is very important for helping us to describe and understand things, those models that we create mathematically, especially in biology, they're used as a guide to help us and not put our pin of, yes, this is true, or no, this is not true, in to support those ideas. Isn't science math often the perfect scenario? Yes, exactly. Like, because it can't consider all the variables. Yes, exactly. Hardy-Weinberg, this equation works really well in a small vacuum for dominant recessive alleles. As soon as you start to increase the variables and calculations required, it starts to fall apart a bit. So again, that's a great way of saying that, Maddie. Math is really good at some of this stuff in small scale, but once we start to apply it to large things, it falls apart a bit. I wonder how the equation would look like, including all of this. Well, I remember studying a lot of it is calculus and data management based. So if you do ever get into to biology specifically, population distributions and population dynamics for animals, you're going to use a lot of calculus, second semester or second year calculus, as well as data and analytics and data management skills. So if you are planning on getting into genetics, population density, population dynamics, genetics, evolution, any of those fields, your utilization of mathematical equations will become a bit more complex as you move up, because eventually you start to take this equation. For those of you who may be familiar with some aspects of calculus, This equation is a derivative of something else, and that derivative is a bit better at describing population dynamics, but y'all don't have the grade 12 calculus level, and it's not a curriculum expectation, so I won't really teach you that right now. So, but yeah, so that's it for this lesson. It's pretty interesting to consider the ideas of non-natural selection evolution. It's important to consider it in the context of your lab. So you have 40 minutes or 35 minutes for you to get into the lab activity / ask questions. Sir, off topic with things in like the physics and chem fields need data management. Chemistry, yes. Physics, not as much, because physics moves from dealing with theories and ideas of mathematical equations to laws, and laws are a little bit different. Chemistry is like half and half. Depends on what type of chemistry you get into. But it might. It doesn't hurt, because you're going to still, regardless of what math or what field of science you get into, even if you take physics, you're going to have to do experiments and test things. And then the use of data analytics and data management specifically, you apply those to experimentational aspects. So the raw math of the laws and the equations that are revolving around physics and chemistry, they don't really use data management. But as you start to test and retest things and analyze that data, you will use your skills that you develop in data management, even if it's at a simplistic level. Do you need to take data management in grade 11 to take in grade 12? No, there's no data management in grade 11. It's just grade 12. And I'm pretty sure the prerequisite for grade 12 data management is 11 mixed math. So if you took 11 UMath, you're good. Sorry, can you repeat what you said? We have to use for our labs. I couldn't hear. Oh no, that's not for our labs. Labs in university, Anna. Not for our lab. No worries, Kiara. Yeah, data management, I think a lot of people find easier than it mainly because data management is like math that you use and you see it in real life a bit better or a little bit easier, or it's like real life application, right? So I understand that stance. So, all right, folks, if there are no questions specifically about this information, I will say you can work outside of the Zoom on your lab. Really, as Shafa alluded to, if you haven't started yet, it is a little time consuming. It will take you a couple of days to work on. Your lab quiz is next Thursday. The lab is due next Wednesday. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days almost to work on this. Please make sure you're using your time wisely if you have not yet started, okay? Yeah. If you can finish it in a day, that's awesome. You should be able to if you really hunker down. But if you need to take 2 or 3 days, that's fine too. You have time. I'm glad you found it fun. I find it a very fascinating lab to see that genetic drift and natural selection and artificial selection happen. You run those simulations. I did a lab similar to this in undergraduate, and I found it fascinating to see the population change over time. So my hope is that you get something from it, and that at the very least, if you don't enjoy, you learn. So. All right, folks, if you want to head out of the Zoom to work on that lab, by all means, I support that. If you want to stick around and ask questions, I'm here to answer any and all questions for you, folks. And if you are heading out, enjoy your weekend. I'll see you all on Monday. Work hard, folks. Work hard. See you on Monday. Have a good one, folks. Oh, I forgot your song, Maddie. Sorry. Whoops. Monday. Have a good birthday weekend.